Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest World Ocean Summit Inside Hour on solutions to manage plastic waste from source to sea, sponsored by the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. My name is Melanie Nerona, and I'm a senior editor with the Economist Intelligence Unit, and I'll be your moderator today. This webinar is part of a series led by the World Ocean Initiative. Details of our upcoming webinars are available on your screen, and there are opportunities to sponsor future webinars too. You can get in touch with my colleague Tatiana, whose contact information is available on your screen. Now, all of these webinars are taking place in the run-up to the World Ocean Summit and Expo 2021, which will be held in Lisbon, Portugal next year between March 2nd and 4th. The World Ocean Summit will run for the 8th time in 2021. There'll be sustainable ocean economy, and we're expecting a bigger audience of around 2,000 participants. We will retain the focus on high-level conversations and policymaking, and also deliver industry-focused sessions along 6 tracks, and that's aquaculture, fishing, energy, plastics, shipping, and tourism. A new and central feature of next year's summit will be a solutions-focused expo. We remain optimistic about welcoming many of you to Lisbon next year. Now, before we get started with today's discussion, a little housekeeping. On the screen in front of you, you will find a media player where you can see today's panelists. There is a Q&A box through which you can send in your questions at any time over the course of the next hour. There's a resource list which includes our newsletter, more information about the initiative, plus some relevant articles. You will also find links to our upcoming webinars, our latest report, and the World Ocean Summit on your screen. Now, we have over 600 attendees for today's webinar, and I'm sure everyone is just as eager to get started. So, coming back to today's discussion on such an important topic, marine plastic pollution. We've all heard the stats. By 2050, there could be a larger tonnage of plastic than fish in the ocean, harmful to marine life. Only around 14% of plastic is recycled, resulting in a tremendous loss of material. And so this need to end marine plastic pollution is driving solutions to improve waste management, to develop alternative materials, and to increase reuse and recycling. And to tell us more, we are joined by a distinguished panel today, and I'm pleased to introduce them to you. We have Jacob Doerr, President and CEO of the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. We have Susan Rufo, Executive Director at the Circulate Initiative. And we have Thomas Müller-Kirschbaum, Corporate Senior Vice President, Innovation and Sustainability at Henkel. Now, I want to structure this discussion into 3 parts. The first section I want to focus on is solutions to tackle marine plastic pollution. In the second section, I want to look at how we can try to scale up some of these solutions. And then the third section, I want to dedicate to our audience questions. So do keep them coming in over the course of the next hour. So let's kick off with our first section on solutions to tackle marine plastic pollution. And I want to go to Jacob first. So Jacob, across the value chain from source to sea, what are some of the most exciting solutions to manage plastic waste that you are seeing?
Thank you very much, Melanie, and it's great to be on this panel today, especially with 2 of our very close partners, Tomas, representing one of our member companies, and Susan as well, one of our project partners here in Singapore. I mean, looking at solutions, it's quite interesting, and I think we are in many ways in a fortunate position today. I mean, you mentioned some of the statistics that highlights the problem of plastic and plastic waste in the environment. And if we go back just 12 months, we couldn't open up a newspaper or switch on the television without watching around all the problems around this, around plastic waste in the environment. Today, that scene has changed. I was just checking my LinkedIn and my Twitter account before coming on here. And now it's actually all about solutions. We know what the problem is. Now the solutions are really coming to the forefront. And that's where the Alliance to End Plastic Waste is also playing. And that's why the Alliance was established just 1.5 years ago, with today 47 member companies that really have come together around wanting to be the solution, to drive solutions around ending plastic waste in the environment. In the short period of time that we have existed, which is only 1.5 years, 47 companies have joined us. They have contributed $1 billion until now, and we are looking at increasing that number, of course, as we go ahead. And we have already launched a number of projects that's going to take place, not only here in Southeast Asia, but also in other parts of the world. I could probably give you a good number of examples of some of the solutions that we're already testing and trialing out there, but maybe let me pick one that is particularly important to me, and that's a project that we have just launched in Ghana, in Africa and West Africa. And I spent myself almost 10 years in Africa, and one of the first cities that I visited was actually Accra, where we have this project. And I still have this vivid memory of me walking down the streets of Accra and seeing the pollution, seeing all this plastic lying in the streets. And I was therefore very pleased that the Alliance was able to support such a project from the very early on. And this particular project that we are supporting is much more than just about ending plastic waste in the streets of Accra and preventing it from entering into the ocean. It's a project that works with local communities. This particular one works with the local female women association, where we are providing them with resources to build a recycling facility, a recycling plant. So not only do they help preventing that the waste actually enters the streets, but they also contribute through their efforts in bringing it back into the economy. Not only do we create a cleaner environment, but we also create livelihoods for these communities and for these families that the women are supporting. We are bringing people out of poverty and creating, in the sense of it, contributing to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So ending plastic waste is much more than just preventing it from leaking into the environment. It's really creating those livelihoods, touching the lives of people and making a real difference.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jacob. I think that's so insightful. And I think you raised such an important point about considering the social impacts of some of these solutions that we develop to tackle marine plastic pollution. And I really like your example that focused on recycling. Susan, I want to come to you to maybe tell us a little bit more about circular economy solutions. What do you think we really need to foster on that front to tackle marine plastic pollution?
Thank you, Melanie. I think we need a broad range of solutions. There's no one solution that's going to solve the problem. We need to start with reducing what we're buying, what we're using. We need to reimagine the products and the packaging that we use and how we deliver those products. We need to collect the materials that they create when we're finished with them effectively. We need to reuse those materials, recycle those materials. In the last case scenario, we need to find a way to dispose of them safely. And then we even need to think about how do we get out there and clean up the plastics that are in the environment already. So, unfortunately, there's no one answer. But there is a broad range of solutions. And I think a lot of it depends on the geography you're talking about. We focus at the Circulate Initiative on South and Southeast Asia. In those countries, we often see that the waste management systems have not kept pace with economic development, with population growth. And so as a result, materials are leaking out of those systems. So one of the first things we need to do is really think about how do we stop that leakage at the same time that we're still looking at all of these other solutions. Because it's really important that we stop the leakage as well as stop the flow to where it could potentially leak. And so when you look at the circle, waste management and collection is a very important part of that circle. It's one of the less sexy parts of the circle, but it's important because otherwise things fall out. You can have the most innovative, most recyclable materials. Once they hit the ocean, they're still just marine debris, and they're still going to have an impact on the ocean. And so, entrepreneurs are out there developing all of these solutions. We're trying at the Circulate Initiative to get them to come into the waste collection and recycling and processing sector that hasn't typically been very exciting, but we think that there's a lot of room to really disrupt that sector. And we're also working on a broad set of enabling policies that bring those entrepreneurs in and help them to succeed by supporting the informal sector, by providing sort of incentives for innovation, by providing public awareness campaigns and that type of thing. So there's a broad solution, but I think there's a broad range of solutions, but I think we have a lot of tools at our disposal.
That's right. And I completely agree with you. I think we have a whole host of solutions to really work with this. Thomas, I want to come to you to get the consumer goods company perspective on this. How are companies such as yours thinking about this plastics pollution issue? Can you tell us a little bit more about what Henkel's doing in this space?
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening from my side. I think everybody is taking the topic very serious, and we need to have a kind of transformation into a circular economy. By the way, that goes in parallel, and we might even come to those links with the transformation into a climate positive, or some people would say climate neutral economy. Just let me before starting, let me address the point. It's not about that we have a plastic issue, but we have a management and habit issue on plastic along the entire value chain. And this is exactly the reason why we in Henkel, and I'm pretty sure other companies are doing as well, programs on that. We have a strategy that is along three numbers: 100, 50, 0. So we start at the beginning of the value chain with the design of any packaging that has to be 100% recyclable. At the time being, we measure that we are at 84%, knowing that there is a gap to close. And it's important to be able to collect and recycle, that all our packaging is then 100% recyclable. And we set out this target by 2025, as all other targets as well, that comes with a 50 and with a 0. So to make it easy, not only for us, but also for others, we developed a tool. We call it the Easy D4R. D stands for Design for Recycling tool. And that is a kind of free software that can be downloaded from our website for everybody. And it's not that complicated, so it cannot be used only by big consumer good companies, but it can be used by SMEs. And we have already, until now, downloads by more than 2,500 partners using this tool, and it follows the guidelines of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So not to invent our own design for recycling guidelines. So that is the topic where we address the first point in the value chain: design for recyclability. The second one, that it comes with the number 50, that is the connection with the climate positive direction to defossilize the use of plastic. So we want to cut 50% of fossil-based plastic against the amount of the material we use in Henkel by the year 2025. How we are doing that? First, we reduce. The keyword has already been brought in by Susan. We reduce the material and have even a great design. And second, we replace fossil-based plastic by recycled material and or even bio-based plastic. Very important to know, if we talk of bio-based plastic, bio-based is not in competition with food. So that's a very important part. So here the topic is that we see that only mechanical recycled plastic will be not enough to bring us to the 50% level, in particular not if we are talking about high quality packaging. And that is true not only for our company, but for the entire industry, talking about food and non-food. So there is a need for advanced chemical recycling. Some people say chemical recycling only, several technologies, and they have to be developed and scaled up in a strong way and fast and accelerated. So the last thing is the 0, and that stands for zero waste into the environment. And here we developed until 2025 a program that allows us to manage the same volume of plastic that we use on a yearly basis. So we have, at the time being, we know that in some areas there is unmanaged plastic waste. We have talked about Asia, Africa, but also in some other developed markets. And there we need to go for example, EPR schemes. We will talk about later on, I'm pretty sure, how to enable governments, cities, the entire value chain, how to tackle the topic of yet unmanaged waste. And that is what we would like to contribute. One thing that we contributed very at the end of the pipeline is collecting the waste, if it is already in the environment, together with the Plastic Bank. The Plastic Bank is an organization that created the word social plastic for the reason that they pay for people, incomes for the poor who collect the plastic and then take it out of the environment. That has the ecologic function that the environment is clean. And we, at the end, can use this plastic and bring it with a branded social plastic into our products. And together with the Plastic Bank, we are in the process to open in Egypt. River Nile is one of the 10 big contributors of plastic waste, and to clean up a little bit of Egypt by these 400 collection centers with around about 5,000 to 10,000 tons of material per year. So 5,000 tons, I think, is a minimum where we go to, and maybe we even go beyond. That material can be used, but you see, 5,000 tons is only a small part. There have to be more and better solutions in the future. But the good thing with Plastic Bank is that it's not only ecological, social, but also scalable, because a collection center can be added to one other, and that is then the way forward.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Thomas. And I think this goes to the point that Susan just made as well. There's a range of solutions available at our disposal, and it looks like Henkel's tapping into a lot of them. From the research that we've been doing as well, we're seeing that replacing some of the problematic plastics with recyclable material is the low-hanging fruit, as opposed to focusing on redesign for reuse. Jacob, I wanted your thoughts on this. What are you seeing in terms of the perspectives of companies that you deal with? How are they prioritizing between the two?
No, I think it's an important question. And I mean, the way that we look at it, our focus is on the plastic waste side of it, right? So it's, of course, there's a lot more happening in the plastic value chain. And I think what Susan also said, we need to optimize each and every part of those touch points in order to be effective when we talk circular economy or circularity. So one of our focus areas, in addition to trying to address or investing significantly in integrated waste management solution, is also front-end design. We believe that in order to optimize the circularity element of the plastic value chain, we also need to look at the front-end design. If we want to bring the plastic back into the value chain, we need to ensure that it has a certain value when it comes after its use. So not only do we prevent it from entering the environment, but we also bring that value back into the economy. And I think in one of your remarks, as well as part of announcing the panel, you made reference to some of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation statistics as well, that the value of the plastic waste that enters the environment today is estimated at between $80 and $120 billion. That's resources that does not have to be lost to the economy. So our focus is sort of mainly on the waste end side, but we want to contribute constructively to the conversation across the value chain. And that also means that we are having and will be having activities at the front end design. It's interesting for us to see how a number of the brands and retailers are making large-scale commitments in terms of, and Henkel made reference to it, and Thomas made reference to it, in terms of their packaging material has to come from recycled material, or the material that they are using has to be recyclable. One of the challenges that a number of the big brands and retailers are faced with today is they're simply not getting enough recycling material back into the machinery. And that's where the Alliance also can help. We can prevent it from leaking into the environment, but we can also bring it back in through the recycling system, whether it's mechanical recycling or advanced recycling.
Sure, that's great. And Susan, I just wanted to get your thoughts. various options that they have available to them.
Sorry, you cut out for just a minute. Could you repeat the question?
Sorry. Between choosing recyclable materials and also then focusing on redesign for reuse.
So I missed a little bit, but I think I got the gist of it. You know, I mean, as we've discussed many times, right, already, there's no silver bullet. And even the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's global commitments have a range of solutions, from reducing unnecessary plastics to increasing recycled content, to ensuring that your materials are in fact recyclable. So I think companies are trying a lot of different things. You know, at the end of the day, the companies are about selling their products, not necessarily the packaging that they go in. And so I think we see the real action coming when incentives and commitments from consumers and companies and governments are aligning. And I think that's where we have the opportunity to make real change. I think one of the challenges is that within these different solution types and within these circular value chains, we don't necessarily know the impact of each solution. So we can't say for sure if a company makes a commitment to recycled content, how much that will reduce the amount of plastic going into the ocean. Or if an EPR scheme is put into place, how much that will reduce the amount of plastic in the ocean. So I think we need to be smart about how we're applying these solutions, but also making sure that we're looking at the impact that they're having, so we know what works where, and how we can be more effective as we start to ramp up those efforts even more.
Fantastic. And I'm really glad you said ramp up those efforts, because I do want to move into the next section of this conversation, which is focusing on scaling up solutions. But before I go to the panelists with some questions, I want to hear from our audience. We have a poll question on this. And so can I please request the first poll question to be up on the screen, please? And the question is, what is most needed to scale up solutions to tackle marine plastic pollution? And the options are investment, technology, regulation, collaboration among NGOs, government, and industry. I'm sure there's a combination of all that we do require, but let's see what comes out on top. I'll give our audience a couple of minutes to respond to that. And in the meantime, Susan, I want to come back to you, perhaps to preface this part of the discussion a little bit. You know, at what stage are we at in terms of the solutions? Do we have some good solutions that we can scale up, or have we not found the right solutions yet?
I think it's both. I think we've got some good solutions already. We know there are some things that work. Some of them are not particularly innovative or new or exciting. You know, some of it's about just basic waste management. We've been doing that for a long time, and we do it really well in some places. So those solutions definitely exist. You know, I think one of the keys is finding the solutions that work in a place and that are going to align with the priorities of cities and communities, and that are providing solutions not just for the ocean plastic problem, but for related problems like health or job creation, greenhouse gas emissions. So I think, you know, when we look at that, we sort of have to think about that solution set in that context. I also think that scale is not necessarily always the answer. Sometimes we should think about small scale but replicable. So if you look at a place like Jakarta, for example, you're never going to get a Seattle trash trunk through the streets of Jakarta. You know, those centralized waste systems are not going to work in those cities. We could think about, you know, smaller decentralized systems. They tend to be more resilient, and they're a way that you could provide dignified employment for the 3 million workers in Indonesia that are part of the informal sector. So we have some solutions. We certainly need innovation. We certainly need people thinking about all of these solutions along the spectrum, but there are also things that we know we can do when we put our minds to it.
Fantastic, great. And I think this would be a great time if we can push the results of this of the poll live, please. Great, and it looks like collaboration has come out on top. So we have collaboration. Nearly half the respondents have said collaboration among NGOs, government, and industry. And we've got regulation at 31% of the respondents. So maybe let's start. Let's talk about collaboration a little bit more. And Jacob, I'll come to you first. What sort of collaborative efforts are you seeing at the moment, and what do you think is most beneficial? Whether it's for industry, for governments, or as a whole to tackle this issue?
I mean, no one can fix this one alone, right? So, I mean, no single company, no single group of companies, no single government, no single UN organization can fix this problem alone. And therefore, the core to any solution that we want to put forward has to come through collaboration. Coming a bit from the UN world, coming from the policy world, I think it is important. And there's always been a call, very much a call to the private sector and to the industry to be the solution provider, to be from where innovation is coming. And I think through the Alliance and other initiatives, I think for the first time we are seeing that the private sector is really coming together through a collaborative effort to invest significant resources in finding solutions and making a real dent in a very defined problem. But we are not doing it alone either. I think part of our strength and success in the future will lie in our ability to collaborate with other initiatives. And today, I mean, if we're looking at the space, it's actually quite a crowded space. The private sector through a number of initiatives, there are a lot of NGOs that are working out there, a lot of UN agencies, and there are a lot of governments. And I think our challenge right now is to ensure that we don't compete, but that we collaborate and we work towards the same solutions. While there are resources that are available or at our disposal for investment, our resources and the resources in general for a development issue, they are not unlimited either. So in order to make most use and best use of these resources, we need to join efforts across the board. From the Alliance perspective, that's why we are working through partners. All our projects on the ground are being implemented through partners representing NGOs, but also working with UN agencies and working with governments. Joining forces is absolutely the key.
Fantastic. And Thomas, I want to get your perspective as well. From the perspective of a consumer goods company, are you seeing any collaborative efforts that are working for the private sector?
Thank you very much. I think I would like to build on what Jacob said. We can be, I think we can be more bold in the collaboration and the targets that we set ourselves. For example, at the time being, there's a discussion about standards. If we talk about the design for packaging and what can be the plastic standards that we use, that we go away from some, let's say, very rarely used materials and maybe end up with the three major materials, PET, polypropylene, and polyethylene, high-density polyethylene, for example, for bottles, because that helps at the end also in the downside part of the value chain to come back with better quality in recycled material. That needs, of course, the collaboration of partners that normally work in competition. And I think this is a challenge also in mindset, and I can only encourage all of us. There is a part in sustainability that is a part for collaboration, for example, setting standards. And there is enough room then afterwards for using also sustainability for differentiation of the offers of, for example, consumer goods companies towards their end consumers. And that's for me the important part. And of course, in those collaborations, if we set new standards for materials, for example, it's important to have also NGOs on board, just to have a right balance and a kind of benchmark in what at the end is also acceptable by all other stakeholders. For that reason, what I said, I can only encourage our partners and peers also to be, let's say, bold enough to go for those standards. And sometimes it helps, like the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, if you have an organization where the CEOs themselves meet and decide together. It's sometimes better as having, let's say, associations. They need to tend more go for an average value, but here we can go really for bold targets.
That's great. And I think you raised such an important point, collaboration between competitors. So thank you for sharing that, Thomas. Susan, I want to give you a chance to comment on this poll result as well in terms of collaboration, because it's come out on top. Is there an example, or are you seeing a really good effort to collaborate between these three entities?
Yeah, thank you. To me, I'm really heartened to see that response, because that's definitely the approach that we've been taking. And, I come from a government background as well as a civil society background. So I feel that it's really important to have all of these voices at the table. And for me, one of the key pieces, I think right now, is thinking about how we collaborate at a city level and really bringing in city governments, because they are so often the level at which waste management systems are decided, investments are made, regulations are put into place, incentives are put into place for small businesses. The public often interacts with their government, so there's a lot of opportunity for education and awareness. So to me, I think those are some of the most important collaborations, bringing in city governments as well as private sector and civil society to find solutions. And then those can inform national level solutions. So at the Circulate Initiative, we have a collaboration with the Global Resilient Cities Network and Ocean Conservancy to try to do exactly that. And we've got 5 cities that we're working directly with to basically figure out in each city, what are the big challenges and how do we start to address them with this group of partners. So, I think, again, the solutions will be a little different for each city because the priorities for each city are different and the challenges will be different. But with that group of partners and that toolbox, I think we can really make progress.
That's great. And thank you for sharing that really good example. I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about regulation. It's the second choice, but about 30% of the respondents. Thomas, I'll come to you first, I think, on this. I want to know how companies can be incentivized to act, and what is the role of regulation in this? You mentioned extended producer responsibility at the start. Have these been effective?
Yeah, so within a strong European background, where regulation is also the strongest at the moment, there is also a good lesson learned, what we can do even better. So regulation is important. And I think it was also mentioned that we have to set the right incentives. Coming, for example, have a look to the German regulation that is for the longest. I think for 30 years, we are here in Germany trying to separate our household waste in paper, in plastic, and lightweight plastic, and the rest. But here it's very clear. At the end, everybody who brings a package to the market has to pay for it in an EPR scheme. But the EPR scheme does not give an incentive, or a big incentive that is really tangible and significant, if the packaging is recyclable. And the law provides this, but nobody is doing that there is a strong incentive if you use recycled material. So that is something I expect, that could be, the German example is only one that's standing for many of those opportunities, where we can go the next step and have, if we, for example, start on city level or on state level with an EPR scheme, that those EPR schemes are directly good for giving the right incentives and to make an economic equation out of it. So that the good behavior we can expect from ethics, and we can expect if we set the right economic equation, including, for example, that without to be a driver, that has to be in the mind. In Europe, it is how to talk about a CO2 tax, for example. Or in Europe, we have the emission trade schemes, and if we enlarge it, for example, to everything where carbon dioxide coming from, like plastic, if it comes from fossil-based, it is a direction directly into the use of recycled plastic. So that could be also part of the right driver. Of course, we have to know at the end of the value chain is the end consumer, and whatever we put on additional, let's say, charging payment into the value chain ends up sooner or later with the end consumer. But here we have also the huge benefit that we do not have any unmanaged waste anymore into the environment. So regulation, rethink it, drive it in direction that it gives the right incentives.
Great. I think that's quite sensible regulation with the right economic incentive. Jacob, I want your thoughts on that too. Is there regulation that's working, and why do you think so?
Well, again, coming from the world of policy making in the UN, where I've been working with governments over many years in developing regulatory frameworks, whether they were legally binding or voluntary. So for me, coming into it, is regulation is a foundation for many of the things that we do in life. And many of the sustainability issues and challenges that we are faced with has its root in certain regulation that differs from continent to continent. I think what is important, in particular around the plastic agenda, that a lot of the action that we have seen emerging over the last few years, whether it's from governments, whether it's from private sector, UN agencies, or whoever, has been happening without regulation actually in place. This has all been sparked by a movement. So what we're seeing right now, that without regulation, we can actually see a lot of good things happening, a lot of good initiatives, and a lot of resources flowing into it. So as regulation now coming into place in the EU, you have regulation already in place, but in other countries, it's still under development. What we need to ensure is that the right regulation, so that is regulation that encourages investments and facilitates investments from the private sector and incentivizes the private sector to increase those efforts, not only where they are in terms of their headquarters, but where they have their global operations. So regulation, we do need policy frameworks and guidance, we do need, but let's make sure that it's developed in such a way that the initiatives and the positive actions that we have seen, in particular from the private sector right now, is not hampered, but encouraged.
Absolutely. That's great. And I think that echoes some of the same sentiment, regulation with the right incentives. Susan, do you agree with that? And maybe is there a perspective from developing countries? I think, and this is something Thomas and I have talked about before as well, that in developed countries, you have strong regulation. What about developing countries? Susan, your thoughts?
Thank you. I do agree. I think, when we talk about regulation, I think we should maybe talk about policy, because regulation sort of implies a negative side. I think there is a role for incentives for sure. And I also think it translates into many different sectors. So, incentivizing the use of recycled content, for example, can have follow-on effects that can help to drive demand. I think particularly when we look at developing countries, policies that help us recognize a lot of the informal workers that are out there collecting, recycling, and basically taking care of those materials are really, really important. They form the foundation of the system in a lot of countries. So I think we need to make sure we think about that when we think about policy as well. And I think that's even more true now in the time of COVID. We're seeing signs that as demand for recycled materials is going down, it's having a huge impact on those communities. In Indonesia, we've heard that volumes in some places are down 80% of what waste pickers are able to collect and sell. 25% of the small aggregators and junk shops are already bankrupt. Prices are down 20 to 50%, and there's an enormous human cost to all of that. But it also is creating an enormous gap in the system that it's going to take us a long time to fix. And so incentives for using recycled content, whether that's a regulation and a standard or some sort of other types of tax incentive, I think can go a long way to help keeping those systems functioning and also keeping those people employed with dignified employment. I think EPR is an example of a demand pull that, in India, we've seen that has had a follow-on effect with a lot of entrepreneurs who are out there trying different collection models, working with the informal sector to help them sell into the system a little bit better. So I think there's definitely a pull there that drives innovation. I think the key is we have to remember that there's no one size fits all. So there's a lot of discussion of things like EPR, but EPR doesn't necessarily look the same in India or in Germany or in Vancouver, and it probably shouldn't because those are very different markets. So we just also have to be aware that the places we're applying those policies are going to be very different. We can learn from each other, but we need to also adapt.
That's great. And thank you, Susan, I think, for raising such an important point about informal workers. They really are the backbone of waste collection in countries such as India and Indonesia, where these problems are most acute. So I think that's a really important point for consideration. I do want to talk about investment, but maybe we'll come back to that later if we do have some time. I'm surprised it's not higher up on the list. I think so. I do want to talk a little bit about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on efforts to tackle marine plastic pollution. Here too, I want to hear from our audience, and we have a poll question on this. So could I please have that question on screen? All right, and the question is, what impact will the current pandemic have on efforts to tackle marine plastic pollution? And the options are accelerate efforts, it won't have any impact, reduce efforts, and perhaps we don't know. And while I give the audience a little bit of time to respond to that question, Susan, I'll come to you again. Maybe just, again, to set the scene for this discussion, it'd be great to get your thoughts on this. You know, with the emphasis on single-use items during this pandemic, whether it's gloves, whether it's cutlery at restaurants, are we at risk of losing the gains we've made on this issue?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I don't think we know the answer yet. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence. Definitely, we've seen an increase in single-use plastics in a lot of places. We've seen reports from places like Thailand that say, you know, plastic waste in Bangkok is up 15%. So there is definitely a risk there, particularly as this goes into systems where we can't manage it correctly. You know, I think that we've also seen even in the US and other places, the turnover of plastic bag bans and things like that as people get concerned about safety. And obviously we need to think about safety, but I think we can be creative in how we are also applying some of these other things. I think we actually have a window to make progress on the issue too, if we think about it the right way. You know, I think the key is we have to base our decisions on science and not emotion. And we have to look a little bit deeper than, you know, this first level of, are we going to use plastic bags or not? And I think groups like Ocean Conservancy can help us sort of sort through some of that science. You know, when we go back to the principle that there are a lot of solutions and we need them all, we can think about the use and the need for single-use plastics in some cases, and PPE and, you know, protective equipment is a great example. Like, we obviously want people to be safe. But if we're thinking about that, we should also think about, how do we dispose of that? Can we use better materials? Is there a way that we can have viable and safe reusable options? And so let's start to think about that. And I know people are. And then, you know, I think COVID has also shown us how important waste management is, even aside from the ocean plastic issue. Cities are dealing with now a different mix of waste. People are taking things home instead of eating in restaurants. People are using a lot of PPE. They're disposing of it at home. So how do you deal with potentially contaminated medical waste? So I think it emphasizes, again, the need to really think about these systems and how they work together and how we can solve multiple problems at the same time. Because I think we have an opportunity, I hate to use that word in relation to COVID, but as we're thinking about how we recover, how we build back, and the investments that governments are going to be making and companies are going to be making, we can actually build back healthier and more resilient systems that are going to allow us to solve a lot of these problems, that are going to help us protect our waste workers, that are going to help us protect the informal sector, and that it's going to help us keep, like, plastic and waste out of the ocean and out of our streets.
Great, thank you so much, Susan. And before I go to Thomas and Jacob for their thoughts on this, I would like to see where the audience stands. So could we please have the results up on the screen, please? All right, so there is, I guess the audience is not as optimistic, is a bit pessimistic on this, that it will reduce efforts. And I'm hoping that perhaps it's a short-term reduction in efforts. But like you said, Susan, I think it's something that we need to think about as we build back. And I'd like to get the comments from Jacob and Thomas on this. Jacob, if you want to go first and share your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think, reducing efforts, I think this is what we are seeing right now. I think we are seeing a decrease in focus on this particular issue because the world has to cope with so many other challenges. But as Susan also said, I think it does highlight the importance of a number of other areas around sustainability, including that the waste management systems are broken in many developing countries, right? And if we are not investing in those as we go ahead, the challenges that we have been faced with in terms of waste management, in particular in relation to plastic waste during the COVID, that has a risk of coming back if something similar would happen again. So I think this is not about going down. It's not about reducing efforts. I actually think as we come out of this pandemic, hopefully, sooner than later, that this will even increase the efforts and the focus on it, and hopefully also ensure that the resources are flowing in that direction. There's also a health element to it, right, in terms of COVID or diseases or diseases in general can be carriers or be carried through waste. And we need to fix that problem also from a health perspective. So let's be optimistic. Let's use the COVID situation right now to something positive. And let's make sure that sustainability, integrated waste management as a broader agenda not only stays on the agenda, but gets increased focus and increased resources flowing into it.
Thank you, Jacob. And Thomas?
Let me add on that. So what I see is, on the one hand, I think the general consumption has gone up, and we measured that. So there was a publication yesterday about what happened here in Germany. I think that stands for a lot of mature markets. That, of course, not only for PPE, but also for protection of food and hygienic measures, more plastic for coverage was used, and the plastic waste, or the waste in general, with that also plastic waste increased by 10% in comparison to the same month in the last year. So there's let's say, we generated more waste and more plastic waste. But on the other hand, I can tell you there is one thing that some people yesterday in a press article assumed, that the industry, like our industry, with the low oil prices, would go away from recycled plastic material to virgin plastic. And that I can clearly state that will not happen. The background knowledge of those who know this, the high quality plastic, recycled plastic, has a higher price than virgin material. That is interesting, because we are used from plastic cars, used cars or used cloth, that they are normally cheaper, but in plastic it's different. So a recycled plastic and high quality has a higher price, and of course the price gap will go up. But there is a clear demand from the markets to use recycled plastic, and nobody in our industry, I can imagine, will go back to more virgin plastic because of just this increasing price difference. So that very clearly there is a consumer demand, and also our direct customers, the retailers, want to see that step further. There is from that point of view, I don't see no change in what comes up in the future. So that is, I think, to bring also good in these bad times. Yeah.
Thank you, Thomas, for sharing that, and I think even for factoring in the oil price into this, which is a very critical component of this discussion. I do want to make time for audience questions. I promised that at the start, and so I'm just going to read out a couple of questions, and if there are any volunteers from the panelists, happy to direct the question at you. So the first question is, what are the best methods for increasing awareness of plastic management in developing countries, where it is probably not the most important issue compared to other everyday problems? And Susan, I don't know if you want to give this a try first.
Sure. I mean, it's a great point, because I think if you talk to most mayors in developing countries, or frankly anywhere in the world, they're not going to tell you that ocean plastic is one of their biggest priorities. And so I think I think when you talk to them about the types of solutions that you need to solve the ocean plastic problem and the plastic waste problem, improving waste management, creating new jobs, building an innovation ecosystem where entrepreneurs can come in and start up new businesses, then that really resonates with them because it basically ties in with a lot of the top priorities of cities, whether it's public health or sanitation, economic development, in some cases tourism when you talk about coastal cities. So I think that the way to approach this is not so much to try to convince people that this needs to be their biggest priority, but figure out how we can solve this problem. At the same time, we can help address some of the other challenges that they're facing and bring new resources and innovations to the table that are going to help us solve all of these priorities. And I think that is really the key to lasting solutions and also solutions that are going to be meaningful for the communities.
That's great. Jacob, do you have any thoughts on that? I think it is such an important question, and we've also been talking.
Yeah, no, sorry, it's a super important question, and I can only echo what Susan is saying. And I mean, looking at one of our projects in Jembrana in Bali, this is all about engagement with the local communities. It's about education and awareness raising. And if we don't bring that into the communities, into the municipalities where we are working, we are not going to have the change that we are looking at having. So what we are doing now is, for instance, in the project in Jembrana, is really working with the communities and with the households and creating awareness around the importance of waste management, creating awareness around what does sorting mean at the household level and why is it important. And through those type of activities, doing that in local languages with support and leadership of the local communities, that's when you get the real buy-in. So we can have the best technical solutions, we can have all the innovation that we are looking for in the world, but if we don't get the local communities and create societal awareness around the challenges, but equally much around the solutions, then again, we are not going to get the impact that we are looking to having. So thank you very much for raising that question and issue.
Great, thank you, Jacob. I think I completely agree with you. I think educating those local communities and incentivizing them to act as well is just as important. Thomas, I think there's a question here that would be good for you. What is the most effective way to stop industry using unnecessary plastic on packaging? There are small steps, but not enough. So, and we've talked about this.
Melanie, I could not hear the second part of your question. So one part of the question was how to stop industry to use too much plastic. That is what I heard. But there was a second part.
That there are small steps, but not enough. That was the rest of the question. But you've got the core part of the question.
Okay, so. First, for me, the topic is also, can we, for example, come to standardization also if we talk about headspace or so in our packaging, and there are even some initiatives thinking about in that direction. On the other hand, we have to know that also plastic has a price, or even if you use paper, so every packaging material has a price, and there is an intention also by being efficient not to use too much of it. That is very clear. And what I said, there could be even, let's say, a guiding regulation. A ban would not help. So that because a ban has to be very smart to go then in the right direction, knowing all solutions best, what is normally not with a regulator. So, but if there's the guiding principle is, for example, in going into using of recycled material and being also, let's say, and using in general less fossil-based material, like I said, that comes with a kind of CO2 tax or CO2 emission trading scheme that also is then enlarged to plastic in use, would anyway incentivize those who are using less of this material or using even more recycled material. That is for me the topic, because it makes an economic equation out of that. That is very logic. So that even helps those who are not only from internal intention acting positively, but also those who are just calculating very smart. They are also then driven in the right direction. A ban, for example, that we have seen also in Europe last year against straws and Q-tips. I don't know if this was really a help for stopping marine plastic pollution. But you see that sometimes regulators want to be fast with something, but it's better to think twice about it, to have the right drive. And at the time being, I see a lot of industry, Alliance to End Plastic Waste, but also others working together in a collaboration, even in a kind of self-commitment or setting self-standards that go in that direction.
Okay, great. Thank you, Thomas. Susan, there's a question here for you. So it says, Susan, when you describe the non-sexy sector as waste management, do you mean donors aren't excited to support it?
That wasn't exactly what I meant, but I think that's true for a lot of donors. But I mean, even what I was thinking of primarily, though, is really entrepreneurs. You know, when you think about kind of cool, sexy startups, you usually think of tech startups or fintech or something like that. You don't usually think about people who are working on, you know, waste collection or recycling or waste management. And so I think that's what we're trying to basically make that sector more attractive, both showing people that they can have an impact, they can do innovative things, they can make money if you're an entrepreneur. So it's some of that about like, how do we bring people in and get people excited about solving the plastic waste problem, solving some of these social challenges, you know, and really helping to build sort of new innovations in the sector. But it is true that, you know, we don't always get, like, all the donations don't necessarily flow to waste management either. And that's true actually when you look at investment, even if you look at things like the World Bank, for example, a very small percentage of their portfolio is actually put into waste management sector. So even just raising the awareness of governments and kind of that demand for more investment in that sector is important.
On the role of technology in addressing this problem. Jacob, do you want to give that a try?
I'm sorry, but I missed the first part of that question.
Yeah, so could you please reflect on the role of technology in addressing marine plastic pollution?
Well, again, coming into it from a waste management perspective, the reality is that, you know, a large amount of resources or plastic waste enters the environment on an annual basis, and that comes from it's land-based. It's a land-based problem that creates a marine litter problem in the oceans. Technology at the end of the day is a critical part of the solutions, both in integrated waste management systems, but also in recycling systems. We heard Thomas referring to that as well. Mechanical recycling is not enough. There's a lot of the single-use plastic that's available on the market now that simply is not coming back through the systems and from a circularity perspective, simply because the technology is not in place or sufficiently tested and tried around advanced and chemical recycling. So to really move and to make a real dent in the challenge, we need to invest in technology and in technological solutions as we go forward. This is very resource intensive. Again, the private sector has resources that they're putting or making available through the Alliance. They're making the technical capacity of these companies available as well. But we need to work also with investment banks. And as Susan also said, there are resources within those banks to address integrated waste management and solutions around circularity in terms of investment in recycling, but the resources are not enough, right? So, and until we start getting solutions, we won't see the real big resources being at our disposal.
Thank you, Jacob. And I just want to note we have just a couple of minutes left, and I want to give Thomas an opportunity just to maybe comment on the same question on the role of technology, maybe in just a minute, please.
Yes, right. So starting with the topic of chemical recycling, that is one hand is the technology, but the other hand is the acceptance of the consideration of chemical recycled material in the legislation that we see in some countries where it's not on the same level. So there's always a priority for mechanical recycled material, but okay. Chemical recycled material is not seen on the same level as good recycled as mechanical recycling. So the technology would be much more, let's say, invested in and would be accelerated in coming up to bigger volumes if also the regulation keeps it considers on the same level. Other things are I think at the end of the pipeline, the collection things, to collect things from the sea or the river, is a nice thing. But I think we have to go with a better design technology at the beginning of the pipeline, and not to solve the problem at the end of the pipeline. It's better to start with a better design rules. I've given the example of our tool.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And that's perfectly fine. And unfortunately, we've come to the end of this panel. I'm sure we could all talk about this for hours. So I want to thank all our panelists for such a lively discussion. It was absolutely wonderful to hear all of your different perspectives. Thank you to our audience for being such an engaged audience and responding to our poll questions and asking so many questions on the chat window as well. I would like to remind everybody to please click on the survey link on your screen to give us some feedback on this webinar. It's only through your feedback that we can be better. So thank you so much once again, and wish everyone a wonderful day.